Welcome to Smarter Athletes Basics in Sport Psychology. We are talking about sports psychology today for a number of reasons, and I want to start right here. This is a pretty good, all encompassing quote from somebody who's no stranger to sport. You have to expect things of yourself before you can do them, and I want to kind of start and finish there and just give you something to think about over the course of the next 15 minutes or so. The reason we're talking about sports psychology today, of course, is because it's a massive field. It's a very, very, very lucrative, growing field in the business of sport performance. And by definition, it seeks to understand the influence of behavioral processes on sport-specific tasks. All right, so athletes and coaches that are benefiting from this kind of thing right now are the people who are really trying to manage things like motivation or athletic anxiety. So how much emotion becomes involved in somebody's state of anxiety during competition, during training, and of course achieving what's known as an ideal performance state, or more commonly referred to as being in the zone. And today we're talking about some pretty basic concepts in sports psychology, so I'd certainly encourage anybody who's interested here to do some further reading. And that reference at the bottom of my slide here is toward the definition that I gave you at the top, seeks to understand the influence of behavioral processes on sport-specific tasks. So of course, sports psychology is a sub-discipline of psychology at large, which many of you I'm sure would be very interested in beyond your high school days. So of course the reasons that we're talking about sports psychology here are many, but one of the biggest ones is psychological efficiency. So our bodies, we know, they are dependent on physiological efficiency. Somebody who can run further or run a little faster while spending a little bit less energy. But there's also psychological efficiency as well. So how efficiently the mind can operate. That is to say, maybe how many tasks can it handle simultaneously. That would be an index of efficiency psychologically. Or how quickly can we process information that's pertinent to our job as an athlete. That would be another example of psychological efficiency. So just as our bodies need to be physiologically efficient, they also need to be psychologically efficient too. So the abilities to maintain an appropriate level of attentional focus, whether that be narrow or broad, to manage our level of arousal or anxiety, and to utilize cues from other players on the field, opponents or teammates, or from coaches giving us instruction, those are all pertinent to sports psychology, and they're all subdisciplinary areas of sports psychology. So appropriate strategies for techniques used by athletes are reflections of good psychological efficiency, and that's what we'll talk about today. Here's another good quote, and it does relate a little bit to the first quote I showed you from Michael Jordan. This is probably somebody who's a little lesser known to most of you, who said doctors and scientists said that breaking the 4-minute mile was impossible and that one would die in the process. Thus, when I got up after collapsing on the track, I thought I was dead. That's Roger Bannister, the first man to break 4 minutes running the mile. Many of you probably know that today there are plenty of people around the globe running the mile in under 4 minutes. Is still an extremely high level of achievement. But at this point, when nobody thought it was possible, there was still at least one athlete trying to do it, despite contraindications from almost every medical professional, especially the sports medicine community, saying you will die in the process of doing this. So let's talk about some basic concepts and issues, because there are a lot more things than just motivation and believing in yourself that are tethered to sports psychology, although that's kind of a nice place to start. Anxiety. So when we look at anxiety in sports psychology, we look at two kind of common forms: state anxiety versus trait anxiety. So state anxiety is probably best explained as an experience of uncertainty. People perceive state anxiety as a negative experience, but its effects could actually be positive too. It's highly variable, and it can be influenced by a small change in the environment, basically. Now, trait anxiety is more of a personality disposition, like a personality trait. An athlete with trait anxiety would currently experience the same symptoms or the same types of arousal in similar situations time and time again. So going forward, an example of trait anxiety might be an athlete who at the start line of every race has the same kind of heart palpitations, the same kind of nervous twitches, all those kinds of things. Now, state anxiety needs kind of a perfect combination of environmental conditions to be performed, and it's probably a little bit less predictable. Now, What anxiety causes, of course, is a response from us, and it's a stress response. Okay, now our stress responses, it's important to consider they can be physical, they can be mental, and more often they're a combination of the two. So a mental stress response is cognitive anxiety, more related to things like worrisome thoughts, self-doubt, those kinds of things. It's a cognitive stress or a mental stressor. Now, a physical stress response, known as somatic anxiety, that's related to things that we can actually feel. So muscles tighten up, or they cramp up, or our heart rate starts to spike and we start to feel nauseous or dizzy, or something changes with our vision. All of those things are physical responses known as somatic anxiety. And like I said, more often than not, we experience a combination of both these types of anxiety as a stress. So stress can obviously play a negative role, but it can be positive too. For example, somebody whose muscles tighten up to a good point of high resting tension might experience a better performance when it comes to their reactive ability. Attention and skill are other big concepts in sports psychology. An athlete's ability to focus is best understood as attention. That's kind of the broader definition. Now, in athletic circumstances, we're thinking about awareness and being able to process task relevant cues. So things like where the ball is or where the defender is, those are task relevant cues that we have to be able to process and make our own decisions based on the information we're processing. Now, that refers to selective attention, our ability to block out things that are not important to us in our particular role and focus on the things that are. A high level of selective attention would be very desirable then. So any athlete who has kind of heightened spatial awareness, really good sense of the space around them, or really good ability to zone things out or block things out that aren't really relevant to their performance and just focus genuinely on the things that are directly in their path and directly related to whether or not they will succeed or fail in their job as an athlete, those are the athletes with a higher level of selective attention. It's most commonly referred to by athletes and coaches as a level of focus and the suppression of task-irrelevant stimuli or thought. So athletes who are able to block out things like a noisy crowd or heckling from some particular fan, or even what one player might be doing with another player across the pitch that's not really relevant to their current task or their involvement in the play on the other side. Those are all selective attention examples that are really the suppression of task-irrelevant stimuli, things that don't matter. Another great quote, I tell myself to get out of the blocks, to run your race, to stay relaxed, and that if you run your race, you'll win. And that's Carl Lewis, who is a great American sprinter, and we understand here that he's basically just saying, do not let yourself get distracted by anything happening outside of your own lane. And that's brilliant advice to the sprinter, and I think if there's any sprinters in the room right now, they can certainly attest to that. So let's talk about cue utilization, because that's kind of where we're going with this narrow attentional or broad attentional focus thing. And when we're referring to cue utilization, we're talking about an athlete's ability to respond optimally to the tasks associated with their position. So if my position requires me to run a certain route, avoid a certain defender, and make a certain movement in order to put myself in a specific position, things that are task irrelevant to me have a lot to do with other players on the field. They have a lot to do with the crowd, and they may have a lot to do with where the ball is at any given moment. I can't get too hung up or too distracted on what's going on in the play if it's not my time to be involved in the play at that point. So cues can be task relevant or task irrelevant. When we talk about cue utilization measures, we're talking about an athlete's ability to choose between the two and respond accordingly. So cue utilization is related directly to an athlete's arousal, how anxious they become or how fired up they become, and the intensity of behavior overall. So the relationship here is non-linear, and what I mean by that is this. So there is such a thing as being too amped or too psyched up. This is not a scientific graph in any way, shape, or form. I should start by saying that. But when we're talking about arousal level and it being optimal for cue utilization ability, it doesn't fall around the 100% mark. Those athletes that are getting so fired up that they're screaming and yelling and bouncing all over the place, they are beyond the optimal level of arousal to utilize cues at their best performance capability. And it's usually around the 60 to 70% according to most researchers that athletes can utilize cues ideally or optimally. Of course, this is dependent on the sport-specific circumstance and the athletes in general. So let's talk about ideal performance state, or being in the zone. This is where we want to end up, right? So ideal performance state is best described as an athlete's optimal mental condition for performance. It's been studied in sports psychology for years and years and years, and it's probably the biggest reason for sports psychology to exist as a subdiscipline of psychology. Today, sports psychology professionals suggest that the following 6 contributions are the best summarizers of an ideal performance state. All right, so we'll look at each of these in detail, but as a brief list here, we have the absence of fear, no self-analysis during your performance, holding on to a narrow attentional focus for the most part, having a sense of effortlessness, having a sense of personal control, and a favorable distortion of time and space. So the first one is a no-brainer. We talk about an absence of fear being an optimal or ideal performance state situation. I think we can all agree that that's a pretty obvious one. So let's get right to no self-analysis during performance. The athletes who do overanalyze their mistakes or make decisions during training and competition that negatively impact subsequent decisions, they are more likely to mess up or cause an error later on in the match or the game or whatever it is, if they are continuously analyzing what they've done. And I'm sure we can all relate to that, or we've all seen professional sports show us evidence of that before. The shortstop who makes an error trying to handle a ground ball, and then is clearly distraught about it, and then makes an error later on in a subsequent inning. After making an error, we see a lot of statistics in sports suggesting that that's very likely to happen again. We also see things like great shooters in basketball missing 1 or 2 shots and then just being so hesitant to take that same shot later on, that their form is compromised. They're not even trying to perform the movement the same way that they've done it thousands and thousands of times in practice, and that can be just as discouraging for the coach as it is the player, because the coach knows the capability, the player knows the capability, but the mental game is not there. So if we dream up some good examples of athletes who are clearly affected, those are a few. I'd encourage you to kind of do the same for yourself and think about how somebody in your sport could kind of be negatively impacted by self-analyzing during performance. So let's go to narrow attentional focus. Narrow attentional focus is an athlete's ability to kind of zoom in on the tasks at hand, block out the ones that are not currently relevant. And some people might argue that a narrow attentional focus isn't always the best thing. And those people might not necessarily be wrong. Of course, somebody like a quarterback will need to kind of carry both. A narrow attentional focus for the person that he's going to be throwing a ball to or handing a ball off to, but of course a broad attentional focus to everything in his peripheral. And that's certainly a great example of a position that needs to be able to master narrow and broad attentional focuses simultaneously. So if we're thinking about people that have to deal with both types all the time, that's a great example. But of course, a narrow attentional focus is so relevant to that quote and that example that I said earlier from Carl Lewis, and so many other position specifics. Focusing in on the job at hand, the task, your only job at that time, and being able to block out all of those task irrelevant cues. Next is a sense of effortlessness and personal control, and this seems like so easy to say, so much easier said than done. And it's not because you're playing against athletes who are less experienced or less skilled than you, but you're playing with increased confidence. And with that confidence emerges this state of effortlessness amongst athletes who are very skilled, who do feel like they're 1 or 2 moves ahead of their opponents all the time. And we kind of see this increased confidence and personal sense of effortlessness quite often in players who are, by sports media being deemed, the next great player of their generation or of their sport, and we see this kind of time and time again, and people kind of look like they're just walking around and not even trying. And it's not that they're not trying; they are certainly trying, but they're making it look easy because they are so comfortable in their skin and they're comfortable where they are, and they've done the drills and they've gone through the walkthroughs thousands and thousands of times, and that's just something that comes with excellence. So when we're looking at the pros and cons of having this sense of effortlessness, this elevated confidence and sense of effortlessness, we want to be mindful of 2 sides of the coin. One is of course letting our guard down and the potential to kind of underestimate the abilities of our opponent or overestimate the advantage situation that we might be in, and that's certainly an overall disadvantage to having this elevated sense of confidence confidence and sense of effortlessness. But when we're thinking about the pros of it, we're certainly kind of outweighing the cons, and this is a desirable trait simply because it allows athletes to kind of operate closer to their ideal performance state, with their head in the right place, not being distracted. Confident athletes are not distracted athletes, and athletes that are not distracted are not paying attention to task irrelevant cues. Favorable distortions of time and space is kind of where we finish here, and this is again might seem quite simple to some athletes, and we say favorable distortions of time and space because these can kind of go both ways. For some athletes, a favorable distortion of time and space means things seem like they're moving a little bit more slowly than they are. Whereas for other athletes, that same favorability depends on things seeming like they're moving a little bit faster than they are. And it really does depend on the type of athlete and the demands of the position. For example, a goaltender would have a favorable distortion happen if the ball seemed to be coming at him or her a little bit more slowly than it actually was, feeling like they can kind of see things happening in slow motion. That's a favorable distortion. Somebody who has to move quickly around an opponent, it's the opposite. They seem like they're moving very quickly or a little faster than they actually are, and that they are virtually uncatchable. So when we're talking about favorable distortions, it is important that we recognize, depending on the position, it could be one or the other. Lastly, let's talk about motivation. So when we talk about motivation for the athlete, we're talking about what's known as intrinsic or extrinsic. Extrinsic is more often referred to as achievement-based motivation in sports psychology. But let's start with intrinsic motivation here. And it is paramount for the success of any athlete. Intrinsic motivation, I've seen it in 5 years working at Bill Crothers. It's highly variable. Athletes that are intrinsically motivated, they're self-starters. They love the sport and the game that they're a part of, and I don't doubt that every single person in a course like long-term athlete development or sport-specific fitness absolutely loves the sport or game that they're a part of. But the intrinsically motivated athlete is also a lot more likely to be somebody who maintains that consistent effort over the course of the entire run, the entire year, the entire semester, whatever it may be, who has that day in, day out attitude, regardless of how the day before went, regardless of how they're feeling on that given day. They're not always scoring themselves. They're not always judging themselves based on their outcome. They understand the concepts of deliberate practice, and they know that they're going to have good days and bad days in places like the weight room or on places like the ice rink. So that understanding kind of feeds their motivation even further. They don't need competition to stay motivated, and they certainly don't need to be motivated by their own results every single time. So intrinsic motivation is a huge part of deliberate practice, which we've already spoken about, and the two concepts really do go hand in hand. Now, achievement motivation relates to an athlete's desire to be competitive, and there's nothing wrong with that. Achievement motivation is also really necessary for a great athlete, and it's based on personality traits like the motive to achieve success and the motive to avoid failure. Now, it's important not to confuse the motive to avoid failure with fear of failure. Now, we want to avoid failure not because we're scared of it, but because we want to be successful. And when motivation to achieve success is related to challenging other people and kind of banking on your skills being better than theirs and your athletic abilities being better, that is not necessarily a negative thing, and certainly can have a very, very positive outcome. So the motivation to avoid failure comes from the desire to protect your own ego and your self-esteem, and it also comes from the desire to be competitive and to win. So let's finish off here by talking about motivation in coaching. There's really four kind of types of motivation coaches tend to use. Starting with positive reinforcement, which is the act of increasing probability of something by using a given behavior. And that's something as simple as the coach just giving some positive feedback on a play or the execution of a drill in hopes that his players will genuinely, respect that feedback and enjoy hearing it and want to perform it more frequently. The next is negative reinforcement, which kind of increases the probability of something by removing an act. And that's not the way you think it is. Negative reinforcement is actually also another beneficial way for coaches to kind of show their appreciation for something by typically maybe having wind sprints or some hard drills and exercise that players generally don't enjoy doing at the end of a session, and maybe having that reduced or removed. So normally we all run 10 hard wind sprints at the end of a practice, but I'm particularly impressed with how you practice today, so we're only going to run 5. The next two, a little bit more frowned upon in the sports psychology world, starting with positive punishment. That's the presentation of an act following a behavior to decrease its occurrence, and that's quite something as simple as, those old school football movies where coaches yelled at players and said, if you drop the pass, I'm going to make you run a mile. And if you fumble the football, I'm going to make you run 2 miles. And kind of using something like exercise as a means of punishment is a classic example of positive punishment, which is generally frowned upon in the sports psychology world. And then, of course, there's negative punishment, and that's even worse. That's the removal of something valued to decrease a behavior, and it's so unfortunate, but we see a lot of that in even little league sport. You know how when you guys play a great game and we win, I take you all out for pizza. Well, you didn't win today, so I'm not taking you out for pizza. That's probably one of the saddest ones ever. So those two at the bottom there, not ones that are generally well liked in the world of sports psychology. So that's everything for sports psychology basics. Once again, if you want to review this presentation in a PDF format, you can download it from strongerbcss.ca. And you know where to find me if you have any questions or concerns. Thanks so much.